Hi, everybody. It's Adam's Music Box on the Saturday stream. And as I told people in some other videos that I posted this week, it's going to be a heavy week for obvious reasons. The blatantly obvious one is a man was gunned down in cold blood for the crime of speaking freely. And as anyone who has followed this channel knows, even tangentially, I'm a free speech absolutist. I talk about it all the time. As a music channel, I discuss it in the context of music and those who have used censorship and the tools thereof to suppress artistic expression, creativity, both in terms of the instrumental note, in terms of lyrical content, and every other piece of artistic expression that relates to those things. Um, I did a stream the other day comparing the very similarities between someone who is on stage to offer up a performance that is informational or political or dialectical. And I compared that to performances of music, performances of dance, because politics, like many other things within our agora, within our polis, to use ancient Greek terms that are rather more accurate than some of the more modern ones, it is all about art and it is all about sociology. These things are related because the artistic spirit is central to that which is implicit in humanity. The very word art is derived from the word artificial, which isn't to say fake, but is to say made from the hands of humans, as opposed to directly from the hand of God, as in nature. But humans obviously are God made as well, even though our ideas, according to many, are the result of free will. And so all of these things are very much related. And we can maybe get into that, but I want to really cut right down to the essence of the horror that most of us witnessed just several days ago. The horror which took a living man and made him dead, which turned a happy wife and made her into a crying widow, which took two children from a loving and normal home and thrust them into a situation which is tragic, just as it's tragic when the children of men sent off to Vietnam for no good reason were left without a father, just the same as it is when children in the middle of a genocide in the Levant are deprived of their parents because of the sickness of war and the sickness of violence against civilians. Now, concepts like free speech and concepts like the universal revulsion at the killing of civilians used to be things that we didn't really need to talk about much. And the reason why is the same reason that we don't need to go into long discourse, being outside the medical community, about the advantages of inhaling oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide. It's because these things were taken for granted. There was an implicit feeling that if you were in a civilized society, you could say what you want and believe what you want and not face violence and other forms of retribution, including censorship, as a result. And likewise, the idea of harming, including killing civilians, was considered anathema. It was something that wasn't really a feature of most ancient warfare. Slavery was, although the slavery in the ancient Athenian or Persian cultures was quite a bit different than the modern transatlantic slavery, which occurred outside of war. But the idea of directly attacking the bodies and property of civilians was anathema in ancient warfare. I'm not saying it's because ancient people were necessarily more moral than modern people. I'm not saying that at all. But the technology of warfare was very different. You needed to be in someone's face in order to take their life, as a hoplite, an ancient Greek soldier, or a member of a Roman legion. The more modern warfare got, the more physically distant one side became from the other. But the paradox of that is that as war became more physically distant, the casualties became increasingly higher and civilians started to be killed. Now, in the rules of war, which were drafted as a means of re-civilizing that most necessarily uncivilized thing as warfare, it was said that the killing of civilians is always wrong. There's the concept of collateral damage, but even then, it's an excuse that most scholars of the rules of war find very hollow, and certain people, and certainly people who have a moral compass or even a moral background, let's say, find it absolutely disgusting no matter what side you are on. People do not, sane people with a grounded spiritual background do not take any pleasure in the killing of civilians. They find it disgusting. They find it sickening. They find it physically revolting. And I think what has really made the tragic assassination of a few days ago that took the life of Charlie Kirk so incredibly harrowing for many people to see is that it was entirely preventable. It was not in a war zone where there is this ghoulish concept of collateral damage. It was not two armies attacking each other. It was an entirely preventable murder because the cause of that murder was what I call the cult of censorship. Now, you cannot prevent every road accident. You cannot prevent people with cancer from dying of cancer. You cannot always prevent people with AIDS of succumbing to that illness. But death through censorship is one of the few things that is 100% preventable. Now, censorship is evil. Censorship is satanic, and I mean that quite literally, because the First Amendment, which in the United States guarantees people the right to speak freely, worship freely, form the press freely, and engage in journalism freely, congregate and assemble freely, that is derived from the Christian ethos. Because what makes Christianity very unique is that it wasn't a religion founded on conquest, it wasn't a religion founded on blood sacrifice. It in fact rejects blood sacrifice because Christ was meant to be the final sacrifice. And when you look at Christianity, Christianity is not about killing for beliefs. It is about praying that your opponents come to see things your way, not just for your own good or the world's own good, but for their own good. And it is that spirit which informed the creation of the First Amendment. It is the essence of civility. It is the essence of Christian ethos. And it's what it separates many demographics, if you will, many sociological distinctions. It separates the rule of law from the rule of the jungle. It separates natural law, aka the law of God, from the arbitrary law of a dictator or a tyrant or a lunatic. It separates that which is spiritually grounded in the moral value placed on each human life, from those who believe that a thought in your head or a concept in the world is somehow more physically valuable than someone else's flesh and blood. All of these things are the subtext, the unwritten rules, the origins of the First Amendment. A First Amendment which didn't create free speech, but which restricted the forces of power, namely the government, from intruding in and curtailing someone's free speech. Again, these are things which, even if they weren't clearly articulated, the essence of them used to be taken for granted. It used to be known. It used to be implicit. And then we became sick. We became spiritually ill. A spiritual cancer grew. And it originated through something called demoralization. Now, where do I get that term? I get it specifically from a refugee from the Soviet Union, a dissident called Yuri Bezmenov. Now, Bezmenov was in the secret police, the KGB, and he was a relatively high level figure who specialized in the political subversion of nations. And he talked about the four stages necessary to subdue an adversarial nation. And I've written down a short version of what they are, and I think it would be beneficial for me to read them. So the first stage is demoralization. Now, what does demoralization entail? This is the stage where a young generation is inculcated with various very strongly propagandized ideologies, where they are told to reject the values of their own society, including its history, its religious foundations, and its moral foundations. Education, media, and culture are all subverted in order to demoralize. Now, mind you, this isn't yet the brainwashing stage. This is the stage that prepares people to be manipulated. Some might call it nihilism. Demoralization happens to be the term that Bezmenov used. And what it means is that it all of the things that we used to take for granted, the rules of the road, the fact that someone has the right of way, and even if you don't like their car, and even if you don't like their appearance, and even if you don't like the ideas communicated on their bumper sticker, you don't T-bone them in the middle of the intersection. You allow them the right of way because there are rules of the road, which, so long as those rules are written fairly, they benefit everyone so that everyone can get to their destination in the safest possible way. This demoralization allows people to do what was previously unthinkable. It allows them to disregard the rules of the road. And in terms of the interaction between ideas and ideology, the rules of this road, in keeping with the Christian ethos in the First Amendment, was that you can say what you want, I can say what I want, I'm free to ignore you if I dislike what you're saying, or I'm free to challenge you either by writing a letter, writing a newspaper article, standing on the street corner with a megaphone, challenging you directly to a debate. Again, that is the essence of the First Amendment. And I think, again, that's again why this tragedy is doubly or triply tragic, because one of the things, if not the thing that Charlie Kirk was most famous for, was saying, debate me, I'll give you a microphone, I've got my microphone, we'll make it fair so that everyone gets a turn, and we talk about it. Harsh words might be exchanged, insults might be exchanged, although usually from the questioner, because Charlie was one of these squeaky clean characters. But the point is, all of this would have been there would have been nothing novel about it if it were if this were to take place in a generation before the cult of censorship metastasized. But let me get back to Bezmenov's four stages. So the first is demoralization, and subverting schools and undermining religion and the family and national values is a really big part of it. This is, of all of the stages, pause for water, of all of the stages that Bezmenov outlined, this one is the one that has the longest period of germination, up to 20 years. The second phase can take as few as 2 or as many as 5 years. And I don't want to get hung up on the numbers because these are the general numbers, but what's really important are the stages. So the second stage that Bezmenov highlights is one called destabilization. And what this one does is it targets core societal structures, things like the economy, things like the military, things like the essence of foreign relations, changing something from being defensive to something either chaotic or ideological. Radical groups and internal conflicts are amplified by the external destabilizing forces. And so engineering inflation, weakening a currency, distorting diplomatic alliances, all about sowing confusion. So first you sow demoralization and make people lose belief in that what they always relied on. It's taking away the crutch from someone with a broken leg. Step two is making it so that the person with the broken leg ceases all thought of regaining a crutch. Now on to stage three, crisis. And this can happen very rapidly. And this is described by Bezmenov as a period of intense chaos and upheaval, often triggered by engineered violence or full-scale economic collapse. And this will lead people to calls for some sort of revolution. It's unrest, it's riots, it's tyranny, it's all of this sort of organized chaos. An element of it, and this is me sort of extrapolating from what Bezmenov said, is the concept is the concept of anarcho tyranny, which means that you have power structures designed to suppress, but their suppression isn't evenly spread. It is spread to certain forces that they want to hold down, while the people doing their bidding are allowed to do it semi autonomously. In other words, organic terrorism from below to frighten and destroy the mainstream population, suppression and economic destitution from the mainstream population. Think the end of the dream of home ownership. Think of the financial impossibility for most people to have normal families. Think of the things that the World Economic Forum has said. These are all things that essentially speak to this crisis. And the final stage is probably the most frightening of all: normalization. Things stabilize into a new normal where a puppet government is installed that brings back stability, but one which has eradicated all of the familiar virtues and all of the familiar comforts and all of the familiar morals that were first toyed with and first diminished in the demoralization stage. So I'll leave it up to you as to where we are in this process, because it's difficult in some ways to say. But what is very clear is that this process has begun. And as a result, something that I mentioned several times already in this stream has come to fruition, and this is the cult of censorship. Now, what is the cult of censorship? The cult of censorship is a religious like experience. It expresses itself with the symptoms of zeal and fervor. And what is the ideology? What is this sort of warped satanic theology? Well, it tells people that censorship is not only valiant and virtuous, but that it is advisable. And like any faith that can be taken out of context and practiced in an extreme manner, these people do not know when to pump the brakes. Now, everything they stand for is wrong, but the further you get down the extremity ladder, if you will, of censorship, the worse it gets. So they start by thinking that it's okay to bully and blackmail and intimidate people into silence. When that fails, they try financial exploitation. They try to use whatever organs of power and influence they can get their hands on. And there are very powerful members of this cult of censorship within the power structure, which leads me to think we might be in stage two of Bezmenov's quadrilogy, if you will, quartet. Um, that they move on to using whatever power they can wield to destroy people financially. If they can't ostracize them socially, they will ostracize them financially, with everything that follows on from that. If that doesn't work, they will use whatever power they have to pass laws that enshrine this censorship. So it's trickle up censorship in this stage. They will pass laws that essentially weaken or ban free speech. And they never do it under the honest guise of, my people are in power, you people shut up. It's never done that way. It's done in the way that satanic forces operate, which is to pretend that that which is evil is good. The sweetest fruit is the fruit of temptation. We are silencing these people for their own good. We are silencing these people for your own good. We're silencing these people from some collective good that remains undefined and has no theological basis that would be familiar to people from even half a generation earlier. Sometimes it involves imprisoning people. Oftentimes it involves intimidating people. Oftentimes it uses one technique that secret police forces around the world have always used. And this is fear, the projection of fear. Now, not everyone in a country like East Germany was a member of the Stasi, their secret police. But the reason that they and similar secret police forces were successful in stifling free speech and free assembly is because nobody knew if the stranger at a bus stop was just a regular old guy or Stasi. No one knew if the guy serving you, a tea at the East German tea house was just a regular guy trying to get by just like you, or whether he was an informant. And so everybody self-censored. And when you put a few people in prison, because you'll never be able to put everyone who hates a tyrannical society in prison, it suffices in most cases to shut people up through the power of fear. Now, what is the fourth and final stage that members of this cult of censorship engage in to achieve their goals? Physical violence, up to and including murder most foul. And that is what we saw minutes after it occurred, in color, in people enhanced it to 4K. No question about it. This was murder by censorship. And the fact that this guy, compared to many other more pugnacious and vociferous pundits, was, he was Mr. Clean. He was a family man. He and his wife were virginal at the time of their marriage, highly unusual in this day and age. They were church going people. They weren't people who resorted to the edgy humor, which I enjoy and I sometimes use on this channel to make a point, albeit here about music, all of which, of course, is totally free speech. And so that again is it's the clearest symptom that many people have yet witnessed, that the cult of censorship does not take in even the most minor considerations of mercy when doing what they believe is virtuous. And again, the trick of the devil is to convince people who used to be ordinary people. He convinces them that doing things which are objectively evil are somehow virtuous. And it's how the devil is able to take weak minds and make them into playthings. Now, don't get me wrong. As I've said earlier, I've never called for political unity. I want political debate. In fact, I want greater political differences because I want people to have choice. The more strong the debates are, the more different the opinions are, the more choice people in a system, assuming elections are fair and assuming people have a baseline of morality and education sufficient enough to make them worthy of the vote. That way you really get to a position where the best man or woman or the best faction wins. And again, I think education, since we're on that topic, is a huge problem, because I believe that people are initiated, unbeknownst to them and their own parents, into this dangerous cult of censorship at a very young age, because the textbooks are corrupt. The textbooks present a didactic view of history and of sociology that is very, very biased and very, very one sided. It is teaching people to think of historical fact, or what is falsely presented as fact, as law. Instead, what should happen is a more Athenian Socratic discourse where people are presented with objective facts, or at least as far as close as we can get to these objective facts, and allowed to draw their own moral conclusions. In a society that has a baseline of morality, whether it's Christianity in America, Confucianism in China, Islam in the United Arab Emirates, Shinto and similar faiths in Japan, when you have that, people will be able to make up their minds without deviating from the basic tenets that hold society together. Again, it's why what is required is spiritual unity, or if you prefer, moral unity, as opposed to political unity. Because if you have that spiritual or moral unity, you can have political disagreements without the country falling apart. You can have political and ideological and artistic and any sort of disagreement without the country falling apart. I mean, think of a band, this is a music channel after all, that breaks up because of musical differences. You don't kill someone because you want to play this in a G chord and you want to play it in an F chord, just to use a very trite example. But we actually have people, water break, we actually have people who believe that differences, no matter how insignificant or seemingly significant, are worthy of, and this is the rot in our society. And that's why when people say, oh, political violence has no place in society, that's quite trite. This isn't really political violence. This is spiritual rot, which has led to a group of demoralized people in society that have joined the cult of censorship. They believe that their violence is justified, where violence against any civilian in your own country or in a foreign country or in an occupied country or in any other situation, it is never justified. It is the very fundamental definition of evil. You do not use physical harm against someone else, no matter what you are feeling or thinking, and no matter what you think that they are thinking or feeling, let alone what they are actually thinking or feeling. And this is what we need. We need a moral message that teaches people what the First Amendment means and explains to them that the First Amendment is morality in action, and that the antithesis of the First Amendment is, in fact, the antithesis of all that is good and all that is sane. Now, mental health, we hear about this a lot, and it's a very serious issue. I would argue that apart from some rare genetic maladies, that most of the crises that we identify as mental health abnormalities are rooted in this spiritual malaise, this spiritual decline, this lack of the most basic morality. And again, if people aren't used to hearing this kind of lexicon, when I talk about morality, I'm not talking about forcing other people into a highly stratified belief system. I'm talking about the most basic rules of the road, the psychological and sociological rules of the road, which says, I may not like you, but I will never hurt you unless it is in physical self defense. I may disagree with you, and because of that, I'm going to ignore you. That is the kind of morality I'm talking about. So now on to this wider question of mental health. The human genome, genetics don't change all that frequently. It takes a long time for genetics to change among a subset of the human species in any piece of geography. And so when we look at what we call the growing mental health crisis, that is not genetic. There will always be some people that have genetic maladies. These people need mercy. They need compassion. If they are a danger to themselves and others, they need compassionate restraint. But what of the people that have clearly lost their minds, but don't necessarily have any of the clear markers of some sort of genetic malady? I think this is the result of the spiritual and moral rug from being pulled out from under society. And as a result, the things that used to be in existence but considered fringe become normal. And I'll take a perfect example. Cocaine is not a psychiatric drug. It can have some psychiatric effects, but the problems with cocaine, I would argue, are more cardiovascular. It was a party drug in the 70s and the 80s. And it was something that people knew was taboo. The people who were at the disco doing the cocaine, they didn't think that they were paragons of virtue. They realized they were engaging in temptation, and at some level, they made peace with it. Some died of it, again, mainly because of cardiovascular symptoms over a period of years. Others walked away from it, others continued to justify it. That is a very different drug culture from that which exists today with psychotropic drugs, particularly the subset of drugs which are the select serotonin inhibitors, the so-called SSRIs, I believe they're called. Yeah, SSRIs. Now, these drugs are considered virtuous, where cocaine wasn't considered virtuous in the 70s or 80s. It was considered decadent. And the normalization of these drugs has been a symptom. It's not the cause, but it is the symptom of this demoralization, where people who are feeling things inside that are abnormal, they are not instructed in the ways of morality. They are not taught that which previous generations and today current subsets of people in countries like the US, Canada, wherever, um, but they're not taught this baseline morality, and that's what they need. They need mental discipline. They need to become martial artists rather than anarchic and violent, because martial arts, and the reason that so many people who want to improve the morality of society, the reason that they teach martial arts is because martial arts is all about disciplining the mind and body simultaneously for the purposes of either organized sports or self defense, as opposed to this anarcho aggression that has been allowed to foment because powerful people in powerful positions running powerful institutions have been able to terrorize us into this cult of censorship. Now, as a free speech absolutist who has talked about this in the context of music on this music channel, and forgive me for not singing a happy tune today, but I think we all know why we can't do that. Um, I've always been very clear about it. And because of that, maybe, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet, maybe that's why I've been able to see this kind of poison, dark, satanic mindset coming more than others, because I see the evils of censorship. I see that it takes a very dark force, and I'm not trying to be overly supernatural or even super metaphysical, but it takes forces of evil, the evil created by the warped minds of people, to create a scenario where people believe that forcibly shutting someone up is virtuous, because that's what censorship is. There is always an appropriate time and place to shut up. Normal people call it decorum. You don't chant vile slogans about someone when they've been shot. No decorum. See, this isn't that. The horrible people celebrating a horrible thing. The solution to that isn't censorship. The solution is finding a way to bring the moral value of decorum back to society. Whether we need to do it by institutionalizing those who have, for whatever reason, become a danger to themselves and others, whether it's about custodial sentences for the crime of being part of a terror or militant network. These are things that we all have to consider in order to separate those who would destroy us from those of us who want to live in peace, for those of us who want to retain and expand this baseline morality, these rules of the road that used to make it abundantly clear. Now, even in eras when people were lied to, this still existed. And I'm reminded of something that Tim Dillon, the comedian, said a few days ago when Charlie Kirk was still alive. So this wasn't related to the tragedy. He said that that forces of power in the government have always lied to us, but most people didn't particularly notice, didn't particularly care. That's a direct quote from George Carlin. And the reason he said this is because, yes, the government lied about JFK and RFK and MLK and the Gulf of Tonkin and the Tuskegee experiment and many other things. But if you worked at a decent to normal rate in a union or non union job, you could have the 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. You could have a couple of Fords and Chevys in the driveway. The kids were always fed. Everything was generally okay, at least for some, if not for most. But the lies were always there. But now, when you take away the fact that we could afford to ignore the lies and still live that decent middle class life, people are starting to notice how dishonest things are. And yet, even so, whenever a politician was shot or killed in the turbulence of the 60s and early 70s, there was universal condemnation. Because even as society was, according to some, and according to Yuri Bezmenov, who I cited earlier himself, the demoralization, according to Bezmenov, began around about the LBJ era. Um, Even so, no one would ever in public, or even for the most part, feel in private that assassinating someone over the difference of an opinion, political, sociological, moral, musical for that matter, otherwise was somehow justified. And today we do not see that. Again, it is a moral problem. And people talk about the unity after 9/11. I don't actually think that applies. I think the unity that happened when JFK was shot or when RFK was shot does apply, because After 9/11, I think some of it was genuine, some of it was forced political unity that already had lost that spiritual unity. People talked about 9/11 in 2001 as a political attack. It was a spiritual attack. And we all know that what they said about who and what and the thermite, that's for another channel, maybe, or another day. But the point is, go back to the assassinations of the 60s, when demoralization either hadn't reached the suburbs, to put it in that way, or was still so early on that the traditional moral background, the moral rules of the road, still existed. There was a video, that a newsreel that was shown on YouTube. I don't know if it was Pathé or one of the newsreel companies that was still around. And there are others. KFMB TV in California has uploaded their version. There's many of these up there where they do man on the street interviews when JFK was killed. And there were two things that are very noticeable in a society where the moral rules of the road still largely existed. One, there was very little hysteria, a lot of sorrow, contemplation, but little hysteria, because hysteria is what we experience when we don't have a moral center to ground us during times of fear or fright. It's what makes us cry a bit less when we see something horrible, and some people might be uncomfortable with that if they're emotional people, but it is also what stops us from being vengeful in the face of horror. And that's why that moral center, that stoicism, is so important. So there was stoicism that you wouldn't see today, and there was also honesty. People didn't feel frightened into changing their views one way or another. These people who interviewed people, there were some in DC, some in California, some in New Orleans. I'm just thinking of the ones most sort of memorable on YouTube. They offered their genuine assessment of President Kennedy. Some voted for him, some didn't. One was one of the statements I remember very well, and I'll try to quote it exactly from memory. And it was that, well, I disagreed with many of his policies, but that's certainly no reason to kill a young man, and I feel very sorry for his family. That is the way that a society that is both honest, normal, and moral reacts to a horrific event. They do not feel the hysterical need to lie, the hysterical need to get overly emotional. Some tears are always a natural reaction, but over the top is when it can lead to other straying from this straight and narrow, if you will. So there was the honesty enough to realize that the First Amendment did not die in the back of that Lincoln with President Kennedy. There was that. There were the condolences, because disagreement did not separate us from a common human and common spiritual condition which binds us together at the level of flesh and spirit. And three, there was the sense of calm, because it seemed like an anomaly at the time. It seemed like a horrible event, maybe by someone with a genetic malady, but that this couldn't happen. The government wouldn't kill the president. A foreign government wouldn't kill the president. People who were trained into a cult of hatred wouldn't kill the president. And just a few years later, when many more public figures, including the senator brother of the president, was killed, people started to get that demoralization, because they started to realize that bad things beyond a malady, a genetic malady and an anomaly, were existing. And so again, the road to sanity is freedom. The road to sanity are the spiritual road rules which allow us to use freedom in a way that feels safe. And another thing that's very important to realize is that freedom from censorship is implicitly related to empathy. Empathy is all about putting yourself in someone else's shoes at least as much as is possible. Without empathy, and without any moral guidance, people, especially when brainwashed into doing it, will hate anyone who's different from them in terms of their opinions or experiences. So the First Amendment is not only derived from a very specific Christian morality, but it is also a matter of it's empathy in action, because you don't have to agree with someone to be able to defend their right to be disagreeable. That is one of the ways that empathy expresses itself. So again, the greatness of the First Amendment is about empathy as much as it is a product of a spiritual people who want to maintain spiritual balance, which is really what which is really what this is all about. Now, I want to close by, well, there's one other point that I want to make. The nation state, the modern larger than life nation state, can really only exist if, again, this common morality supersedes the tribalism of ideology, the tribalism of any other sort of identities. And the more identities you have, the harder it is to create a center. But the nation state has always been something that was supposed to supersede the tribe. Tribalism is incompatible with the nation state, which is why a spiritual morality that sets these road rules is all the more important in a nation state than it would be among a small tribe, even though small tribes, at least some of them, some of the more advanced ones, have their own sense of morality. Now, I want to revisit some of the topics I talked about earlier this week, which goes back to the concept of why this particular incident was so very horrifying. And I see there's some very nice comments on the side there. I thank you both for leaving this. Now, one of the things that I talked about earlier was about how the reason that I'm speaking about this on a music channel is because everything done on the stage is a form of performance. Charlie Kirk delivered political viewpoints and political information. A violin player delivers sound produced from the instrument. A politician delivers a admonition to vote for him and not the other guy. And he'll give you the reasons why, hopefully based on logic, but not always, but that's okay too. Now, in performance, and Shakespeare did quite wisely say that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. On the stage there is a feeling of safety, and this feeling of safety is derived from a concept known as the third wall, an invisible plane that separates the stage from the audience. What this means is that you can do things on stage that might seem a bit awkward or a bit out of place on the street or even in the middle of a park. The stage is like a secular sanctuary of performance where anything goes. And the audience is on the other side, and for them, they can feel anything they want. They can laugh, they can cry, they can boo, they can leave, they can, get happy. But there is that third wall, which means that there is an emotional separation between two people interacting, which gives them both a sense of safety. Now, there's also that implication that this third wall guarantees you physical safety. It's why, for instance, when there is an actor simulating a police chase on stage, and someone gets shot, that the audience feels something emotional, but they don't feel something that is terrifying, because unless they are a child or someone with certain neurological deficiencies, they realize that it is make believe, it is acting, it is a simulation. It is what Picasso said: art is a lie that helps us to better understand the truth. This applies to anything that goes on any stage. It goes back to the Platonic idea of forms, where everything we see and interact with exists in a realm invisible to us, or at least semi-unobtainable to us, in a perfect form, and that which we see on earth are just mere representations of this form. Immanuel Kant talked about a similar subject. His concept of noumena and phenomena is very much related to this Platonic ideal. Now, when that bullet entered the stage and took the life of that innocent young man, Charlie Kirk, it was also it was a molestation of this third wall, a violation of this third wall. And I think that makes a lot of people very scared. The safety that we had in knowing that what goes on stage cannot hurt you, and what goes on in the audience cannot hurt the person on stage, shattering that also shattered something that again was implicit in this morality, which is that as an advanced and civilized society, or at least one that used to be, we understood the tolerance of the stage, and the people on stage understood the autonomy of the audience. In other words, the people on stage wouldn't become violent against an audience that was bored, and the people in the audience wouldn't extract vengeance on someone on stage for any irrational reason that they could think of. And we sort of broke that the other day. I mean, the film The Joker, as a film, portrays the breaking of the third wall when the guest on a talk show host extracts vengeance on a talk show host that is physical rather than oral and argumentative. And again, it is a symptom of a society that has lost its morality, a society that no longer has these moral road rules. And I'll end again with what I said the other day about what the great modern German composer, who's now deceased of old age, Karl Heinz Stockhausen, said about the atrocity on 9/11 shortly after it occurred. He compared it to a work of art, saying that it was the most profound work of art ever. But it wasn't the work of art of the angels. It was a Luciferian work of art. It was the work of art of the devil. And the reason that it wasn't because of its grandeur and its moving nature, in this case, moving people to tears, moving people to fear, moving people to other very sad thoughts. It was the devil's because the people who were the participants, the victims, in other words, were involuntary members of this satanic project. They didn't agree to die for their beliefs, for someone else's art, for anything at all. They had the idea that they'd go into the tower to do commerce or to go to the shopping mall underneath or to do whatever they wanted to do and go somewhere else afterwards, just like a normal day. And they were robbed of that ability by Luciferian art, the same way that Luciferian barbarism can rob people of their life in a street or in a park. All crime, to one degree or another, is the product of moral decline. That isn't to say all acts that are harsh or strong. Self defense can be moral, even if brutal. But these acts of violence, whether it's based on your adherence to an evil cult of censorship, whether because it's the greed that underlies a crime of opportunity, it is all a symptom of decline. And with all of these things going up, and you don't need a statistician to know that they're all going up, there is a serious moral decline. We don't need new laws, we need true laws and the enforcement of those true laws. We don't need to make people more stupid and more subservient. We need to give them the tools about how to think rather than simply turn them into robots who are told what to think. We need to be a society where compassion is balanced out by realism rather than a society which mistakes compassion for weakness. We need to be a society where we can be more honest with each other while fearing no repercussions from that honesty. Otherwise, education is possible. And yes, we need to be a society where education is based more on facts and less on a one-way street to didactic oblivion. All of these things need to change, and there are real world ways to change them through art, through culture. Music is so important in helping to build a zeitgeist. Music cannot change your mind, but it can change your way of life. We need, in some cases, to repeal some legislation and to enforce other laws in a more exact way. We need the mental health practitioners to regain a sense of spirituality in their mission. And we need to be very much more honest about the fact that everyone can say what they want, no matter how strong, edgy, or disagreeable, but that there are certain people who are a physical danger to themselves and others because of the mental rot that has resulted from spiritual decline, and they probably do need to be in a mental institution for their own safety and for the safety of the rest of us, and possibly even for their own eventual salvation. So, because I didn't feel like talking about a musician or a record or whatever, I wanted to talk about something that affects all of us. something that affects the art, something that affects the artist, something that affects the civilian, the citizen, the child, the father, the man. It affects everyone. And I think that now that we have seen true horror in places that are otherwise familiar, it's not the horror that we see overseas or the horror that we see in the past, the real horror of the present day, the right here, the right now. I think that we need to make sure that things like this never happen again. And unless we get real honest with each other and real peaceful with each other following that honesty, then I fear the worst. But as always, we pray for the best. Take care.